Thanks very much, Don. Yeah, this is a technology conference, and our theme is technology, sweet technology. But I think I'm going to change gears here now slightly and talk a little bit about people. So as Don said, I am the head of innovation at Internet Solutions. And innovation is typically associated with product innovation. But at IS, we look at innovation a little bit more broadly. And one of the areas that we're looking at specifically is our employees. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey that we've just been on in terms of what we like to call the quantified employee. Now, if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, just think back to Robert's talk. I think a number of people were slightly scared by some of the aspects of Robert's talk, but he kind of spoke about people who were connected. So the essence the essence of this talk really is a play on the words the quantified self. So the quantified self, the essence of that is taking information on a continuous stream from various sources. And it's typically things like your health information, your heart rate, how well you sleep, all of those sorts of things, and basically becoming massively obsessive about yourself, which is why my wife won't allow me to wear a wearable, because she just knows how obsessive I get. And really what we're doing is taking that same set of technologies, some of the things Saki spoke about this morning, some of the things Robert spoke about, and applying them to the employee. So I'd like to take you on a little bit of a journey. And just imagine something for me, and I think this won't be too difficult because many of you are managers. But I'd like you to imagine that it's 2 years from now, you're a manager in a large enterprise. See, this clicker's up. And it's Monday morning, which is never a good day, and your boss has just phoned you, and you've just got off the call, and he's not happy. You're working on a really large project, and your team is behind schedule, and he's entirely unhappy. And your morning didn't start well either, because one of your female employees actually stormed out of your office because the newfangled HR system gave you information that you possibly shouldn't have had, and so you inadvertently implied to her that the reason she's so stressed out at the moment had less to do with all the work you've been piling on because of this project and more to do with the fact that her love life is not quite what it was last month. Not only that, you're starting to get more information coming through, and it's also not good news. The top employee in your team appears to be, there's a 2% chance, is what the system's telling you, that he may well be an office sex pest. So if this is the kind of dystopian future that we're going to get from all of this information that we're going to analyze, why on earth would companies want to actually look at anything like this? So what are companies actually hoping to gain? Well, there's essentially three things. Sorry, this clicker is a little bit laggy. There's essentially three things. We focus on the employees, the clients, and business. So specifically about employees, it's very, very important for companies to attract top talent and then to have that top talent be engaged. Because there's a direct correlation between having top people and engaged and happy top people and having satisfied clients. And if your clients are satisfied, they tend to stay with you. And if you've got good people, good clients who stay with you, what follows tends to be a profitable business and productive employees. In fact, if you go to the SAP HR analytics system, it actually promises you that it can actually measure productivity per employee and profitability per employee in real time. I'm not entirely sure how realistic that is today, but let's actually go another year into the future. So 3 years from now, you've ironed out some of the problems with this HR system of yours, you've just got off the phone with your boss. It's a Tuesday morning this time, because even 3 years from now, Monday's still a bad day. And you've actually managed to fend off a lot of his objections, because the system is actually telling you that your team is spending perfect amount of time on task, that they're doing exactly the right things. And in fact, the problem that you've got with your project right now is that you're under-resourced, and that's his problem, not your problem. Not only that, your HR system is no longer giving you bad information, but you've also been on an HR course which explains to you how to have difficult conversations, which you never really had before, with all of this new kind of data that's been coming in. And it turns out that the possibility that one of your top team members was an office sex pest actually had everything to do with the fact that you were working him too hard, and the poor guy actually just wasn't getting to shower, and he was sleeping at the office, and the disgusted expressions that your system was picking up on people's faces, it was just actually due to a little bit of bad hygiene, but he's cleaned that up now. So how do we get into this utopian future that I've just explained to you? Well, it's probably worth going back about 100 and some years to actually look at how people used to try and bring people into companies and then try and manage people. Because ever since we've had companies, we've had people trying to find the top people and then manage the top people. Well, at the turn of the last century in Philadelphia, a factory manager used to throw apples into a crowd of prospective job seekers. And the idea behind that was the people who were fast enough nimble enough to catch an apple and then strong enough to hold on to it were precisely the kind of people that he thought that he would actually want working in his factory. Now, it doesn't take a lot of thought to actually figure out that's not the greatest way of actually sort of identifying and then attracting top talent. And things got a little bit better. So really what you had was a problem with both data and methods. So things got a little bit better with the methods. After World War II, a lot of learnings came out of the US Army and a new science that started to look at new management techniques called scientific management techniques. And there's quite a long history over here, and I'm going to sum it up really in one way, and that's to sort of liken it to homeopathy. A lot of people swear by it. A lot of people think that it actually works. But when you actually hold it up to the cold, hard light of science, it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Move on another 50 years, and at the turn of this last century, in the early 2000s, we suddenly had massive improvement in statistical analytics and a whole lot of new HR analysis methods that came out. So I can sort of see you kind of going, well, you know, if there's so many of these wonderful methods, why have I not heard of them? And it's possible that you just actually haven't been looking close enough. Because the HR technology industry, specifically in software, is a $15 billion market. And my team is actually tracking through research organizations over 100 startups in areas like recruiting, talent analytics, assessment science, workplace wellness, things like employee recognition, continuous learning systems, employee comms, and even just sort of normal core HR systems. Now, obviously, that's a huge amount and a huge landscape to cover. So I'm not actually going to cover the stuff on the bottom of the screen there. I'm going to cover the stuff on the top of the screen. So let's change gears again. If you go to any CEO anywhere in the world and ask that person what the greatest asset is, what answer do you think you're going to get? It's our people. So to use an analogy, if you were the owner of a fleet of cars, let's say, and you went to your fleet manager and said, why have we chosen these specific cars? And he goes, I love Korean cars. They're really polite, they're hardworking, they're smart, and they're really good at mathematics. You kind of give him an odd look and go, okay, so why not German cars? No, Germans are too pedantic. American cars, much too arrogant. Italian cars, no, lazy and unreliable. So you go, okay, that doesn't sound good. But let's actually talk about some metrics here. You know, what kind of fuel economy are we getting? Oh, we've got the data, but we don't really measure it. What's our replacement rate like? How can we forecast into the future what cars we're going to need in terms of growth of our company? No idea. I mean, you'd fire a manager like that. So why is it that we deal with our people in exactly the same way? So the most recent research we could find on the subject was actually a study done by Deloitte about 18 months ago. And they found, they surveyed about 3,000 companies, so it's a pretty big survey, and they found that 90% of organizations were quite happy to predict or model budgets, financial results, expenses, basically money stuff. But out of that same group of companies, only 4% were happy that they could predict or model their workforce. So what's the problem here? Possibly it's just a lack of data, because it's really not an issue of skills. We've got the kind of skills that can do all kinds of clever stuff with numbers in the financial side, so maybe it's just that we're lacking data on people. So where can we get data on people? What are the sources of employee data? And the first and obvious one, and we kind of made a pact with everyone that we weren't going to talk about Uber in this Internetix, and I see Saki broke it first, so I'm going to break it next. I think the first source of employee data is, sorry, can you just move on a slide for me, please? Is the employee mobile application. And the one that I think most of you in the room will be familiar with is the Uber application. Not the one that's on your phone, but the one that's on the driver's phone. So the next time you're sitting in the back of an Uber catching up on the latest in Congolese politics, I want you to think about what that phone is actually doing, that app on that phone is actually doing for that driver, and what you could do in a similar situation for a similar app for your staff. First of all, it's giving him continuous assessment. After every single activity that that driver does, he's getting an update on how well or how badly he did that. How often do you do KPIs? I know at the Dimension Data Group we do them twice a year. We certainly don't do them after every single piece of work that we do. And there's a whole lot of other things that those applications actually do. They do things like jobs, timesheets, forms, expense tracking, all kinds of things are actually sitting on that application. Now, there are companies that actually write applications specifically that do the same kinds of things that Uber apps do. So what are the other sources of employee data? Well, Robert basically bombarded us all this morning about all the concepts of wearables. But I'm just going to give you some examples about wearables doing some really interesting things. Now, the US Army is actually a very early adopter and very aggressive adopter, if you'll excuse the term, of wearables. And what they do is they actually track the health metrics of troops in combat. So wearables in this context actually save lives. They look at things like heart rate, core body temperature. They're doing some very, very cool research in terms of things like sharing battery packs so that you're not actually having a single battery per every type of wearable and heads-up display, et cetera, that you're using. And they're also doing things like looking at skin patches. Robert touched on one or two of those sorts of things. There's some very interesting stuff happening with skin patches and measurement. It actually looks at your perspiration and uses it as a kind of proxy for what's happening in your blood chemistry. So very, very interesting things happening in terms of saving lives. Other industries also use wearables. The retail industry, for example, companies like Tesco and Amazon use something very similar to what you see on there. I know it's really ugly and it's not exactly a fashion item, but basically what that is, it's a replacement for a clipboard. And it allows companies in warehouses to actually track workers as they move around, pass jobs on to them, tell them where to go, do all kinds of things, track them in real time, and do predictive analytics. Very, very interesting. Sometimes wearables aren't always wearable. Now, there's a company in Stockholm, Sweden. It's actually a workplace called Epicenter. It's actually inserted RFID chips about the size of a grain of rice into 400 employees. Now, what this RFID chip actually does is allows people to open doors, operate photocopiers, buy food in the canteen. I can hear what you're thinking now. You're kind of wondering why you can't just use an employee badge for something like that. But clearly, there's sort of more at work here, and clearly things get a little bit creepy in certain places. But wearables, probably in a bit of a less contentious example, is wearables also improve wellness. So I think everyone will completely get and understand this, being in South Africa with companies like Discovery and their Apple Watch promotion. What BP did as part of what they call their million step challenge is they actually gave out 25,000 Fitbits to employees around the world. And the idea there was obviously to improve their employee wellness. The employees scored because they got a free Fitbit, and they obviously had a lower cost health plan, and BP scored because they potentially had more engaged and happier workers. Now, what's also quite interesting about the way we currently manage employees is we tend to manage employees as single items, whereas I don't think it's a very highly contested fact anymore that typically most of the value that comes out of people in organizations now comes out of work from groups. So employees also reveal group behavior. And what you see in this picture in front of you is a very, very interesting wearable. It's basically just a wearable badge from Hitachi, but it's packed full of sensors. Now, typical Japanese, they do some quite interesting things there, and one of which is obviously not just to sort of track where individual people go, but actually to sort of monitor what kind of group interactions are happening. And they claim to be able to pick up the emotions of people based simply on the accelerometer in the chip. So I don't know if you just get a bit of a spring in your step if you work for Hitachi, and therefore they know you're happy, or you're a little bit mopey, and then they know that, hang on a minute, you're not quite so happy. But these are the sorts of things that are available today. These are devices that, in fact, Hitachi sells this on a pay-as-you-go type of basis with an analytics system that goes with it. Now, I just want to stop and pause for a second and ask you a question. How comfortable would you be if I called one of you up on stage here, and we'd done some analysis of your email interaction with your colleagues, and we'd analyzed the emotional tone of that email interaction? Not what the content of the email was, we don't care about that, but just kind of how nice you were. I think most of us would sort of feel a little bit uncomfortable. I mean, if I had to call you up and ask you without actually analyzing, I think most people would say, no, I'm sort of friendly but firm, or something along those sorts of lines. But I mean, I think if we had to analyze certain people's emails, you might find you're obsequious with senior management, arrogant with your peers, and maybe a bit nasty to people under you. I don't know. I'm possibly just speaking for myself. I'm not sure. But this is the sort of thing that's now entirely possible with sentiment analysis. And sentiment analysis is not actually a new thing. This is technology that's actually been around since 2002. It was originally employed to analyze things like product reviews, movie reviews, all of those sorts of things. But it's very, very easy, and in fact, it is being used now to basically analyze sentiments of people's emails, what they call the emotional polarity of the emails. Now think of what you can do with that information. Think of the bad apples in your organization, or what HR people sometimes call the toxic element. You could first of all easily identify them, possibly identify them from all the toxic emails that go to them as opposed to the emails that come from them, but that's another issue. So if the emotional tone of your email says a lot about you and how you interact with your colleagues, what about the look on your face? Now, I'm going to ask you a question that I doubt that anybody's asked you, and that is, do you know if you suffer from resting bitch face syndrome or not? Now, I know there's a couple of people in the audience that might go, well, I don't really know what it is, so I'm not sure that I can actually answer the question. And resting bitch face syndrome is actually a meme that appeared on the internet in about 2013. And if you do suffer from it, and I hate to tell you, in an audience roughly this size, there's about 20 of you who do, what it is is when you're standing just with a kind of neutral expression, or what you think is a neutral expression on your face, thinking about nothing more interesting than what you're going to have for lunch, apparently what comes through on your face is anger, disgust, and contempt, more so than the normal neutral expression that people have. Now, if you're thinking about having lunch in the Dimension Data canteen, then anger, disgust, and contempt are possibly not wholly inappropriate emotions. But you're also in fairly good company. As you can see, Kanye West is one of the celebrities who suffers from what I'm going to call RBFS from now on. People like Kristen Stewart, the Queen of England, a number of other people. And in fact, my team actually accused me, this is how I found out about it, my team actually accused me of suffering from RBFS. And I was quite upset. I went back to my wife and said, this is what my team says that I've got. And she said, oh, don't, come on, that's not a thing. Well, unfortunately, surprise, RBFS is actually a thing. And there was some research recently done by Jason Rogers and Abby Macbeth last year. And what they did is they actually used a system called a Nolder's face reader to do something called facial action coding. And what it does is it actually reads the emotion on your face by taking 500 points of your facial musculature, and it works across multiple different racial groups and ethnicities, and it actually just works. Now, if you're curious as to whether or not you suffer from RBFS, there's a URL. Don't worry about writing it down. We are going to retweet it probably around about now. But I mean, if that doesn't qualify as URL of the week, I'm not sure what does. www.nolders.com, test if you have resting bitch face. Okay? So, unfortunately, what I did is I took a selfie of myself, trying to look as neutral as possible. Don't laugh. I uploaded it, and unfortunately, my team's right. I do suffer from RBFS. And as you can see, it's just really those slightly elevated levels of anger, disgust, and contempt. So the next time you're thinking of lunch, just worry about what the look on your face is saying about you. Now, are we as Internet Solutions particularly worried about whether our staff suffer from RBFS? Not particularly. What we are interested in is the fact that there are systems out there that can actually measure how happy or sad, etc., somebody is. And there's a whole lot of emotions. It's quite curious that joy is the only kind of happy emotion, and there's a whole lot of other sort of negative emotions, which is, I suppose, a very human thing. But what's also very interesting is there's a whole lot of other scientific techniques. So once you've identified that somebody's sad, you can then figure out how sad they are by actually looking at their pupils. So there's pupillometry, oculometry, and a whole lot of other things you can do. So that's just a small subset of the ways you can actually quite easily, with cameras in lobbies, cameras on people's PCs, work out what your employees' emotions are. So goodbye the employee satisfaction survey, and hello cameras in the lobby. So you've collected all this employee data. What can you do with it? Well, that's a question that a lot of people have been asking quite recently. Well, in fact, from 2007. And there's actually a rising interest. Sorry, do you mind just forwarding the slide one? There's a rising interest in what is now known as HR analytics. Things like people analytics, HR analysis, workforce analysis, constantly increasing interest in this. Unfortunately, for some reason, not particularly in South Africa or Africa as a whole. And so what are people interested in looking at? Well, there's primarily three categories of things. The one is workforce productivity, the other one is attrition prediction, and the third one is recruitment prediction. So let's just look at workforce forecasting. Workforce forecasting is really what I was sort of alluding to when I was talking about the cars and saying, how things are going to look in our future. And that's really what you do when you look at your forecasting retirements, forecasting talent shortages, all of those sort of things are now able to be done statistically. Retailers can do this now. I mean, in the past, most retailers will tell you that they put more people on the point of sale points during month end and that sort of thing. But now you can take external data like weather data, sports fixture data, and actually analyze that in terms of areas of where your retail outlets are and actually allocate and do sort of proper workforce forecasting. Attrition prediction is actually quite interesting. And what's interesting about this whole thing now is you're actually moving from much more of a reactive, looking back into the past type of mindset and looking more into the future. And attrition prediction is really about looking, and there's a whole lot of different things, and I'll just give you one example now. It's taking multiple sources of data and looking at the fact that people potentially don't just leave in singles anymore, they tend to leave in groups, and doing kind of statistical analysis using various data sources, trying to figure out who's going to leave and why, and possibly mitigate that. Recruitment prediction is not particularly new, so I'm not going to go into it in a huge amount of detail, but I think it's a well-known fact now that artificial intelligence systems do a way better job of analyzing people's CVs and resumes than our HR department does or we do ourselves. So if this all feels a little bit overwhelming, don't worry, you're actually in good company. Most organizations are actually in what we like to call the metric stage. Now, the metric stage of HR analytics is really characterized by a kind of a reporting mindset. You're typically looking at single indicators like employee satisfaction per region or those sorts of things. And the next stage that organizations kind of need to get to is what's referred to as the analytics stage. Now, the analytics stage is characterized by much more of a predictive mindset. There's a lot more rigor associated with collecting the data. And I'll just give you one example that actually might make you think, and that's the ability to take data, for example, like your employee satisfaction data and your employee address book, talking about where your employees physically live, mapping that onto some kind of mapping software and working out the quality of those employees' commutes. Because it turns out that if employees are happy but they've got a terrible commute, they tend to stay. If they're unhappy and they have a terrible commute, they tend to leave. And the last stage of the evolution is what's referred to as the insight stage. Now, insights is when you find unexpected insights that are not easy to guess, they're not necessarily intuitive. And the best example I could find of this is not really an HR example. It's actually something from the London Underground. And what they did is they actually analyzed, anyone who's been on the London Underground will know this. If you don't, just take it as gospel, that when you get off a train and you're trying to head out of the station, if you just want to stand on that escalator, you stand on the right. If you want to walk up the escalator, you walk on the left. It's almost like a law of nature, and you violate it absolutely at your peril. Now, it turns out that the London Underground takes in something like 5 million people per day, takes in and spits out that number of people. So they're very, very interested in finding more efficient ways to do things. They did some analysis that said, you know what, if you actually make people stand on both sides of the escalator, it's actually more efficient. And when I read this report, this really, really bothered me, because they were talking about getting something like a 28% improvement in throughput by making people stand side by side and not letting people walk up on the left. Now, in fact, I was so bothered by this that I actually analyzed it myself using an agent-based modeling tool. I think just pause for a second and feel sorry for me that while you guys were watching rugby, I was busy doing sort of models on a tool called NetLogo, and it turns out I got exactly the same result. And what's interesting there is that not so much that this is true, but they actually tested it out last December. So on a particular day, they got a whole lot of policemen to stand there and shout at people and tell them not to walk up on the escalator. And they got a lot of angry commuters, and they actually got a better throughput improvement than they expected, than they'd actually modeled. And what's critical about this is as soon as they took the policemen away, the people started walking up the left and standing on the right. And it's important to understand that even when you find an unexpected insight, if you can't action that unexpected insight, it's not very useful to you. Some of the other challenges we've got with statistics and statistical management system is that managers don't think statistically. So just one example of this is, at the beginning of this talk, I told you about the fact that maybe one of your employees had a 2% chance of being sexually problematic. Now, anyone who understands statistics will tell you that 2% is virtually meaningless because there's an error term and various other things. The other interesting thing is that managers tend, and here's a tip, next time somebody asks you how's that project going, you want to give them some kind of a statistically predictive answer. Don't say that there's a 67% likelihood that things are going to go well, because your manager is going to put you into the he's unsure category. Managers like to have numbers in the high 90s before they'll say definitely yes, and in the low single digits before they'll say definitely no, and they characterize everything else in between as unsure. So that's problematic if you're going to have systems that are spitting out figures like there's a 55% chance of this and a 67% chance of that. The other challenge you've got is that managers are just not life coaches. So you're going to be potentially collecting huge amounts of data. How much people sleep, how well or badly they're eating, how happy or unhappy they are. And there's going to be an expectation that you're going to do something with this information. And the question is, are your managers actually trained to do this sort of thing? Something else that's also worth thinking about is something called the stress paradox. And that's the whole reason we do this is to actually have happier employees who are more engaged and more efficient. Whereas actually when we potentially give them all kinds of wearables that are constantly reminding them to stand up and sit down and do all of these sorts of things, and your heart rate's above baseline level, please do something about it, we could potentially stress them out and actually make them less happy. Now, Stucky stole a little bit of my thunder, and in fact it just proves how fast the world is moving. I had a whole section here on something called the observer effect, and that's basically how people game systems. And what Discovery announced, I think it was yesterday or the day before, so very, very recently, is they've actually dropped a whole lot of wearables off their accepted list of things which will actually allow you to get vitality points. And the reason they've done that is because of people like my friend who used to strap his iPhone to his dog's collar and make it go for a run on the Rondebosch Common. So when we put measurement systems in place, we've got to understand there's something called the observer effect, and that is that where there's measurement, there's people gaming that measurement. So what can we do? Well, you could possibly do something that we did. we're about to embark on an experiment. So the experiment is really about looking at all the stuff that Robert and Saki spoke about this morning and actually working out what is actually practical. It's all very well saying, yes, you can have wearables, yes, they're wearables, yes, there's facial action coding, all of it, but how could we actually employ it and make it work? So the test really is to use things like wearables, facial coding, text analysis, and voice analysis, and not just play with it. Constantly have people coming up to me saying, oh, you got such a cool and easy job, all your guys do all day is play on cool toys. And that's absolutely not the case. We spend a great deal of time in my team working out plausible business reasons why we can play with cool toys all day. And the plausible business reason in this case is, think about what you could do with wearables if you could predict employee satisfaction. That would be useful. Think about what you could do if you could do sentiment analysis on emails and predict customer satisfaction, possibly even predict customer churn. That could be really, really interesting. Now, don't worry, in this particular trial, we're not going to be measuring any of your emails, so don't worry. Your anger is very important to us because we do need it potentially to predict customer churn. So we'll tell you when we're measuring you, and hopefully there'll be no observer effect where you suddenly get all nice to us even though you're not happy. And I think the other thing we're going to look at is, in terms of what's practical today, is employee privacy. I find it quite interesting that privacy came up in Saki's talk, came up in Robert's talk, and it even came up in the Wi-Fi talk. So privacy is a critical issue, and you're going to hear a number of people talk about privacy today, and we're going to look at things that we possibly didn't think of once we've had our group of volunteers actually wearing these different wearables and having their emotions tested. The other thing to look at is what possible benefits the employee could have. Because unless there's some sort of a trade, there's no real reason why the employee would want to give you this sort of information. Now, there was a recent Deloitte study, or was it a PwC study, I forget, which kind of implied that most South African employees were like really happy to have wearables, whereas in fact, you've got to be careful because what that study also showed, there was 20% of people who didn't trust that their company would actually use the information correctly, and 20% of those people didn't believe that there would be any benefit to them. And the last thing, of course, is to look at who would potentially game the system and how. So you've got to understand this is a very emerging and challenging field. It's fraught with ethical issues. And the kind of data that we're going to be collecting on our employees is going to make the player statistics that you see behind me look like child's play. And we're really going to the heart of some sort of pretty deep human mysteries, kind of how we grow, how we develop, and what we ultimately become. But make no mistake, there's organizations that are currently embarking on much larger scale experiments than the one that I've just described. And this field is actually going to change the way we manage employees forever. So I don't want to leave you with a negative view. I think it's important to understand that the quantified employee is a definite opportunity for good. Sorry, do you mind just moving a slide forward, please? So it's a definite opportunity for good. It's an opportunity to improve employee wellness, improve employee engagement, and let's face it, also improve efficiency and productivity. It's something that we can't ignore. So I'm going to ask you to do something. Tomorrow morning, after Internetix, hopefully we won't have overwhelmed you too much. What I want you to do is go into the office and start thinking about a couple of things that leading companies are doing in this space. So the first thing that companies are doing is actually looking at what data they can potentially link together. Data that might be readily available, maybe not in a useful format yet, but just something that they could put together. Also, start looking at building out an analytics capability. And if that is unfeasible in your organization, look at ways of outsourcing it. There's all kinds of ways of outsourcing or crowdsourcing analytics capabilities for very, very small projects at very, very low costs. It's also important to visualize data better, because if we've got managers who don't understand the difference between a 55% chance of something happening and an 85% chance of something happening, we need ways of actually conveying that information. And this is a huge field that my colleague Jeff Fletcher is very, very interested in. He even goes and talks to art students at Wits University, and to me that means the world has been completely turned upside down. When an engineer goes to a group of art students and starts telling them how to use color, I know that the world has changed. Also very, very important is to take talent data seriously. In our systems of record, things like our payroll system, we obviously guard those jealously, but some of this new talent data also needs to be treated seriously. We need to treat it like money. We need to treat it in the way that our employees would actually trust us, because trust is crucial in this whole experiment. And lastly, I think it's important to do some experiments. Come and talk to us, see how things are going with us in about 6 months' time, but go and have some fun. So I'm just going to leave you with one last thought, really, and that these kinds of systems shift the balance of power very, very strongly in the company's favor. And so, in the immortal words that was spoken to Spider-Man when he first came into his powers. With great power comes great responsibility. Please use it wisely. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.